we know now for sure that people who tell us about the near-death experience, it must have happened during a period that the brain didn't function at all.
There was a very interesting story in the book about the man with dentures.
Yes, so you can prove that this NDE happened during a period of cardiac arrest. When people have this kind of experiences, first of all, they think they're crazy. It doesn't fit in our current materialist worldview.
How have you changed as a result of this inquiry, Pim?
In Europe, there must have been 125 million people who have an after-death communication. And in the United States, about 100 million people know that people with a cardiac arrest have no brain function at all left. Retrospective studies, and most people thought it was just anoxia of the brain, neurotransmitters in the brain, hallucinations, dreams.
You would have no fear of death, right?
No, I'm not. I'm curious. It's not the same as people with a near-death experience. They're 100% sure. I think I'm 98% of 99, but the brain function stops. There should be no consciousness, let alone an enhanced consciousness with the possibility of perception out and above the body, with emotions, with cognition, with memories from early childhood, etc.
Dr. Pim van Lommel, thank you so much for joining me. I feel really lucky to have the opportunity to speak with you.
You're welcome.
Let's go back to the beginning. What drew you? Can you tell me a little bit about your origin story and what drew you to cardiology? Why choose that field?
Well, when I was on school, I was doubting between a study of physics and a study of healthcare, of medicine. And then at last I took medicine, and then I took cardiology with a lot of physics in it as well. So I'm what we call a beta. And that's how it started. And I loved my study, and I loved being a cardiologist as well. But yeah.
And so you would have studied in the late 60s?
Late 60s, yeah.
So medicine has come a significant way since that time, right?
It's incredible. When I studied medicine, cardiology was just about congenital heart disease and valve disease, and that's it. And in '69, it was the first coronary care catheterization, and in '71 was the first bypass surgery in Holland. And I was working in the first hospital who were doing this cath lab and heart surgery as well.
That's amazing. So you've seen medicine almost like go for the study of cardiology go from almost the embryonic stage to what we know now, which is massive.
Yes, I'm very grateful for it. So when I just, as a young doctor, started in my specialization, I just was working one of the first coronary care units in the Netherlands because of the modern techniques of resuscitation, which is the defibrillation and external chest compression, were just available. And until 1967, all patients with a cardiac arrest died. So it was all new coronary care units as well. And it was, when I started specialization, there was one medication available, and that's it. But when you got coronary care and then heart catheterization with a coronary angiogram and a bypass surgery, and then later PTCA and stents and pacemakers and ICDs and a lot of medication, etc., rhythm diagnostics, etc. So it was, I have just seen the start of cardiology until what it is now. It's incredible.
I've heard you say science is asking questions with an open mind.
That's it.
Yeah. Do you feel that the scientific community can be dogmatic, rigid, or even inflexible?
It is. Still now, quite a lot of scientists have been raised in the materialist science, and they're just fixed in this dogma that everything can be explained by just when you can objectify something and can measure something, when you can duplicate something, or when you can falsify something, then it is true. So all the facts must be objective, measurable. But then the problem comes with consciousness. So what you think and what you feel, you cannot objectify, you cannot measure, you cannot duplicate, you cannot falsify. So then they have a huge problem. And that's why they just tell us consciousness is just an illusion, it's just the brain what you're looking at. And consciousness does not exist at all. And that's still the majority of neuroscientists and also even philosophers or psychologists still have this idea. And so have to change science as well. And that's what you said. Science is asking questions with an open mind and forget what you've learned, forget the concept you've learned, because otherwise you will miss new facts and new ideas.
Do you think there's an element of protectionism?
Right? It's fear.
Yeah.
It's fear. I think when you have always told and written articles and doing research where to find consciousness somewhere in the brain, and you seem to be wrong, then you lose your research money, you lose your position in university. I know some professors have lost their position in universities because they had the different ideas. So they're frightened. And I know some professors who do privately tell me, you could be right, but officially they say this is total nonsense until they retire. And then they said, I could have been wrong my whole life.
Of course, of course. You began researching NDEs in 1986, but you had an experience in the late 60s. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, that was what happened in the first coronary care unit in the Netherlands. So we resuscitated a man of 44 years old who had a cardiac arrest due to acute myocardial infarction. And we had, I think, 3 or 4 times defibrillation, and he regained consciousness after about 4 minutes. And we were so happy as a resuscitation team. I was the doctor in charge. It was all new for us. And the patient regained consciousness. He was alive again. But the patient was very, very disappointed and told us about going through a tunnel, talking about a light and beautiful landscape, beautiful music. There was some people, I've never forgotten this event, but I didn't do anything with it. I just started my specialization at a young family with 2 small children. So I never forgot it, but I didn't do anything with it. Until in 1986, I read a book by George Ritchie, Return from Tomorrow. And George Ritchie had a near-death experience in 1943 as medical student. He had a double pneumonia and he died because there were no antibiotics available for this medical student. And his body was covered with a sheet, and the nurse was so upset that this medical student had died that she was able to persuade the doctor to give him an injection with adrenaline right into his heart, which was totally uncommon. But he regained consciousness. He was, after a period of 9 minutes, he regained consciousness and was back again in his body. And he had a very deep, a very extensive near-death experience, very impressive. I always advise people to read this book. You can read it in one evening. It's so an impressive story. And that's why my interest and curiosity started to grow after reading this book.
Yeah.
So because of reading this book, I got it from a good friend of mine. I just started to interview patients, ask patients who had survived a cardiac arrest in the past, if they could have memory from the period of unconsciousness. And within 2 years, from 86 to 88, asking 50 patients who survived cardiac arrest, and 12 of them shared the NDE with me. And then started my scientific curiosity, because I've always learned from university, medical school, that it is impossible to have memories from the period of unconsciousness. When the heart stops during cardiac arrest, there's no circulation, no breathing, you're in coma, you're dying, then it should be impossible, because the until now never proven hypothesis that consciousness brought the brain function, then it should be impossible, because when the brain function stops, there should be no consciousness, let alone an enhanced consciousness with the possibility of perception out and above the body, with emotions, with cognition, with memories from early childhood, etc. And there have been 4 studies done with survivors of cardiac arrest. Our study is still the largest one, the only one with statistical analysis. We have 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest in the Dutch study, and there was a study in USA by Bruce Grayson, and 2 studies in the UK, one by some partly pedophatic and one by ricercatore. In a total of 562 patients who survived cardiac arrest.
Mm.
And what we found out that there was no medical explanation at all to explain the cause and content of an NDE. So we could exclude anoxia of the brain as an explanation for the cause and content of the NDE, because all patients also in our study had been unconscious because of lack of oxygen in the brain, and only 18% reported an NDE. And when we compared the 18% of patients with an NDE with the 82% without an NDE, all survived cardiac arrest. There was no difference at all in the duration of cardiac arrest, 2 minutes or 8 minutes, didn't matter at all. The period of unconsciousness, 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, didn't matter at all. Complicated CPR with the need of intubation, a lot of medication, didn't matter at all. We had 30 patients in the cath lab with electrophysiological studies, and they all resuscitated within 30 seconds, didn't matter at all. So the severity of anoxia of the brain didn't matter at all to explain the cause of NDE. And until that time, there were just retrospective studies, and most people thought it was just anoxia of the brain, neurotransmitters in the brain, hallucinations, dreams, whatever, false memories. So we could explain all the other explanations as well. So we could exclude psychological explanations like the fear of death. We could exclude use of medication, whatever they got, it didn't matter at all. We could exclude gender, religion, if people were atheists of Christian or Muslim, didn't matter at all. Education didn't matter at all. Foreknowledge, that you know that these experiences are possible, didn't matter at all. So the main conclusion of our study was there was no medical scientific explanation why people have a near-death experience in cardiac arrest. That's the first thing. The second aspect is that we know that people with a cardiac arrest have no brain function at all left. So there have been studies on induced cardiac arrest in humans, let's say for threshold testing in ICDs. So you induce a cardiac arrest, you test the ICD to find a good threshold. And we also have done these studies in animals. What we see in those studies that when you have cardiac arrest, you lose consciousness within seconds. The blood flow to the brain, when you can measure here the carotid artery, is zero within 1 second. The body reflexes are gone with the function of the cortex of the brain. The brainstem reflexes are gone, so the yank reflex, you put a finger in someone's throat without any problem. The corneal reflex, there are fixed dilated pupils who do not react on light. There's no breathing anymore. The brain center is close to the brainstem. And when there have been studies done with the registration of the electric activity of the cortex of the brain, the EEG. The EEG always flatlines within 10 to 20 seconds. So we have proven that there is no brain function left after 20 seconds after cardiac arrest. And there is no patient ever been successfully resuscitated within 20 seconds. It always takes several minutes, even in the coronary care unit, to get people back. So we know now for sure that people who tell us about the near-death experience, it must have happened during a period that the brain didn't function at all. And that's the main conclusion. And then there are also aspects of the NDE, like the out-of-body experience, that people can have critical perceptions from a position out and above the body, which can be corroborated by doctors, nurses, and family members. And so you can prove that this NDE happened during a period of cardiac arrest, because you can also see at what moment of the CPR of surgery the out-of-body experience happened. And there have been now 2 books with more than 200 cases of corroborated theoretical perceptions during out-of-body experiences. And it seems that 98% of those corroborated theoretical perceptions were totally true. It really, what they told us, happened during CPR, during cardiac arrest, during surgery, or during coma. So it proves that it is not an hallucination, nor a delusion, not an illusion. It is really happening, but the brain does not function.
At what point, according to your book, I think you intimated that at 5 minutes, severe brain damage when somebody is going through experienced cardiac arrest and is clinically dead, severe brain damage starts to take place.
Well, after about 5 to 10 minutes. So you have to initiate CPR as soon as possible, because the first 5 to 10 minutes, the loss of function of the brain is still reversible. That's why we call it clinical death. Clinical death is a period of unconsciousness caused by lack of circulation and breathing, and it's still reversible. But when you're too late, then there is irreversible damage to the brain and people will always die. So clinical death is the first stage of the process of dying. And we know from people who have a cardiac arrest outside the hospital, so out of hospital arrest, but you're not always as soon available. So you have CPR. The mortality rate is more than 90% because you're too late.
Yeah. There was a very interesting story in the book about the man with dentures.
Yes.
Can you tell us that story again?
It was also published so our study was published in the Lancet in 2001. And our study had two parts. That was the prospective study and the longitudinal study. We'll come back later to the longitudinal study. But the out-of-body experience of this man was very impressive. He was found in coma in a meadow about 30 minutes before he was brought into a hospital. And people just found him and did some primitive CPR. When he was brought into the coronary care unit, his body was already cold, was blue. There was no circulation, no breathing, no body reflexes, no brainstem reflexes. His pupils didn't react to light. So the nurse were quite upset with this young man who seemed to be dead. And the first thing he did was to start intubation to give him more oxygen. And when he tried to intubate the patient, he found out that this patient had dentures in his mouth. So he took out his dentures and put them somewhere on the crash cart. And it took 1.5 hours before they had adequate circulation and heart rhythm back. But he was still in coma, still needed artificial respiration. And so he was transferred to the intensive care unit to continue the artificial respiration for 1 week until he regained consciousness. And then he was brought back to the cardiac ward. And he was just there when a nurse came in for medication. He saw the nurse, he said, "You know where my dentures are." And the nurse was flabbergasted. And he said, "Yeah, you were there when I was brought into a hospital. And you took my dentures out of you put it somewhere on there was a car with all those bottles on it, there was a sliding somewhere underneath, and there you put my dentures." And he could explain everybody how they looked like, the doctors and nurses. He could describe from above the resuscitation room where he was brought into coma and was left in coma. So he could describe everything into detail while I was in deep coma and during the period of CPR. And this is what we call corroboration of theoretical perception. The nurse knew exactly what had happened, and the patient told him.
And the extraordinary thing about the story as well is that he was clinically dead for an extended period of time. I mean, you mentioned upwards of 30 minutes at least. Yeah. He should not have recovered. Did he make a full recovery?
Yeah.
He made a full recovery.
It was cold weather. Perhaps that could be a possibility. And it took 1.5 minutes CPR to get him back. But he was young, so the people was just trying.
Yeah.
To give all the energy to get him back. But he was lucky that he came back.
Can you think of any other possible explanation as to how he may have? Is there anything else that occurred to you? Any rational, materialistic possibility of how he would have known about this?
I was raised as a materialist scientist, materialist cardiologist. So before I could believe that this was possible, it took some time as well. So it took several years after starting our study before I was changing my mind, and now I'm convinced that the brain does not produce consciousness, but the brain has a facilitating function, not a producing function to experience consciousness.
I've heard both yourself and other commentators and people who are studying NDEs say that the brain is a filter as opposed to a generator of consciousness.
Yeah, a transceiver or a filter or well, you can call it also an interface.
Mm.
And to understand this function of the brain is, I always like to compare it with the internet. There are now at this moment 1 billion websites and YouTube films go through your room, through your body. Some are always everywhere in the world, but you need a functioning computer to receive a part of this cloud. You need several codes to get several websites of YouTube films. But the websites are always there. And you need a functioning computer. And so you need a functioning brain to receive parts of this enhanced, or what I call non-local consciousness, to receive into your body and brain as a waking consciousness. And it's just a part of these memories as well. Because when you're out of your body, that's what we hear from patients with a near-death experience. You have all memories from early childhood. You're connected with other people as well. You have sometimes future events as well. So you are in a realm where there is no time, no space. Everything is connected. And that's why we call it non-local consciousness. Everything is always connected without time, without space. So when they have a live review during a cardiac arrest for 5 minutes, they can talk for weeks because everything happens at the same moment. When you think of somebody, you will meet him. When you think of a place, you will be there, always at the same moment. So it's a total different kind of consciousness as we have now, as we're sitting here in our waking consciousness.
The accepted the materialist scientific explanation is around what you mentioned was anoxia, right? So oxygen deprivation. You refute that argument completely, right? For NDEs.
Yes, I think we could prove in the 4 prospect studies in surrounding cardiac arrest that we know that during a period of a non-functioning brain, a percentage between 15 and 20% of those patients reported in classical near-death experience with all the universal elements that are possible. And this should be impossible. We should not expect people to have any memory at all because the brain function has ceased. So it's what we call the paradoxical occurrence of enhanced consciousness with the possibility of perception. And all the centers in the brain who are important for this kind of experience, also for memories, do not function at all during the period of cardiac arrest.
In your study, you compared how people changed after cardiac arrest, those who had an NDE and those who didn't. And the findings were fascinating and quite moving, actually. What were your, can you tell us
that was our longitudinal study. So we made a taped interview with all patients with an NDE who were still alive after 2 years and 8 years, with a matched control group of patients who survived cardiac arrest without an NDE. Matched control means the same gender, the same age, and the same time interval. What we found when you compared the 2 groups with and without an NDE, there was a statistical difference between patients with a near-death experience and without an NDE in their transformation. The classical transformation is no fear of death anymore. They have a new insight of what is important in life. It's about unconditional love, compassion, empathy, first towards yourself, accept your own negative aspects we all have, and then have unconditional love, empathy, compassion towards others, towards nature, towards animals, towards plants, towards planet Earth, because you still feel connected with everybody, with everything. And you know now that it's all about giving love to others. It's not about power, it's not about money, it's not about a beautiful body, not about clothes, it's about treating others as you would love to be treated yourself. It's the classical comparison we know. And the third thing is that people have the enhanced intuitive sensitivity, which is that they know what other people think and feel. And they say they know future events, they know when someone is ill, they know that someone will die in 3 weeks and they will die. And it is very difficult for those people who have this kind of information you don't want to have. You think of somebody and the phone call and he's calling you. So there's what we call scientifically a non-local information exchange. You receive information not by your senses and not by your body, beyond time and beyond space. You see future events, you see things on a distance, you know what people think and feel. And that's quite disturbing as well. And the other thing what we found is that when people have this kind of experiences, first of all, they think they're crazy. It doesn't fit in our current materialist worldview. And when they try to talk about it, nobody will believe it. Doctors won't believe it. Nurses are a little bit better, but also family members and partners don't believe you. So they keep silent. I've met patients with an NDE who have been silent for 50 years because they could not talk about it. And then it is a period of depression, homesickness, and loneliness. So it's a spiritual trauma for years, despite the positive content of the NDE. And as soon as they see a film on television, or they read a book, or they talk, or hear someone talk about an death experience, then they know I'm not the only one. It's called an NDE, and then they start to share it with others, and then they can start to accept it, and later to start to integrate it into their daily life, and they change the way they live. And it can take 20, 30, 40 years. So it's hard work, despite the positive content of the NDE.
Yeah, but ultimately it is a significant life-changing experience. I mean,
Yes, it is.
It's
incredible.
It's quite incredible. Neil deGrasse Tyson spoke about NDEs, and he made the point that very often you're relying on subjective eyewitness testimony, and we know from eyewitness testimony that it can be falsified or it can be flawed, and we see this all the time in courtrooms, chillingly enough. What's your perspective on eyewitness testimony as the main arbiter of evidence?
Well, what I told you before, you can corroborate veridical perceptions that people have had, and what they told us as subjective experience happens to be true in reality. So what they could perceive from a position out and above the body really happened at the moment of the coma of cardiac arrest or surgery. They can meet deceased relatives, even if they don't know that they were dead as well. So it's also an objective aspect. So you can see some future events. I know people have written down what they have seen in the future events, and they can later, skip it off because it happened years later as well. So there are some objective facts which you cannot deny at all. And there has been a study done about the quality of memories in patients with a near-death experience that was done in Belgium. And when you compare the quality of memories from patients with an NDE with memory from things happened in daily life, the quality of memories with an NDE is much, much more severe and strongly. And when you talk to patients, when the NDE had happened 50 years before, they talk about it with the same emotion as it happened yesterday. It's totally different from normal memories.
What is the problem with the brain as a computer analogy comparison? Is there a problem?
For me, there's no problem, but the problem is by material scientists who still believe the never proven hypothesis that the brain produces consciousness. But then all these experiences should be impossible. So when the brain doesn't function and you still have this enhanced consciousness with the possibility of perception out above the lifeless body, with cognition, emotions, with memories from early childhood, etc., that should be impossible. So material scientists have to change their mind, but it's hard for them because they're frightened that they still have a wrong worldview. It's all in their work.
Neuroscientists and neurosurgeons would say that the likely location of consciousness is the cerebral cortex. What would be your perspective? Am I right in making that assertion?
Well, as I told you before, the brain doesn't function at all. There is no part of the brain which is active. There's a flatline EEG, which is the activity of the cortex of the brain. And to have our waking consciousness as we have it now, according to modern neuroscience, you have many neural centers in the cortex who coordinate information and exchange information with each other. It's called the global neural workspace. And it's not at all available during cardiac arrest. So it's, according to our current neuroscience, it should be impossible to have any memory at all.
What's the role of DNA in consciousness?
Well, we don't know. Let's say, I think, personally, and I've written about it in my book as well, that it's not just the brain functions as an interface, but I think the whole body functions as an interface. So different aspects of consciousness have different interfaces. So each organ in each cell has an interface function. And my idea is that DNA could be the interface in each cell. And because what we know that when there is when an egg cell and the spermatozoa comes together after 4 cell divisions, the cells are changing into heart cells, brain cells, whatever, different kinds of eye cells, etc. They differ, but the structure of DNA in each cell is the same. But the function of the DNA changes because of information from outside. It will also know from the epigenetics. So information from outside can change the function of the brain, not the structure, but the function of the brain. So genes go off and on. And we also know that after organ transplantation, even let's say heart and lung transplant, people sometimes have changes in their character. And we don't know who the donor is, but in the United States, after 5 years, you can ask who the donor was, and changes in the character fits quite well with the character of the deceased donor who gave organs. So when you receive an organ, it's still a living organ. Let's say a donor is not dead at all, it's brain dead, but 97% of the body is still alive, is kept alive, and you need a functioning organ for transplant, not a dead organ. So this transplanted organ still functions as a kind of receiver of interface for parts of the consciousness of the deceased donor as well. It's also another aspect. So I personally believe that DNA, especially what we call the junk DNA, could be an interface for aspects of consciousness.
And in the book Consciousness Beyond Life, you do talk about, and you refer to the memory and personality transplants, which are almost inconceivable and very difficult to understand how that physical material transplant could be influencing personality. Is there any studies that you can think of, or has there been scientific research into that?
Well, there have been studies done. We refer to it in my book as well. There have been 10 young patients who had a heart transplant who changed. And one of the heart transplants could tell about the murder of the organ donor. And there's a book, Change of Heart, published, and it has been well researched, but there is no prospective scientific study done. We tried to do it in Europe or in Holland, but transplant centers do not want to cooperate on this subject. They refuse it.
Wow.
And even also, we don't know in Europe who the donor is, also not after 5 or 10 years. It's only in the United States that it's possible to know it.
What in terms of the future of the field of research for near-death experiences, what is left to uncover? I mean, there's a significant amount, of course, but where do you think researchers should be directing their efforts?
I think we have changed science. To change science, we have to include subjective experience in science, what we call the post-materialist science. We have to accept subjective experiences as a scientific tool. We have to believe what people tell us. We have to, because what you are, the essence of who you are, is what you think or what you feel. And we know now, because of all these prospective studies, that this essence of who you are, consciousness, is eternal. There's no beginning, will never be an end to consciousness. So for me, the main thing is not have more research, but to spread the word about it. Let's say, giving interviews like I'm doing now, reading books, Zoom interviews, articles. Also on my website are many scientific articles, just peer-reviewed journals, the published articles. And people have to know about it. I think the general population knows much more about this kind of research than the most materialist scientists. They have an opinion, which is usually prejudice and willful ignorance, because they don't know the literature as well. So for me, the most important thing is that people will read about this research and think about it. And the change will come from the general population. Let's say another aspect, let's say the after-death communication, that people have the idea that they are in contact with the conscious of deceased relatives in the first days, weeks, of months after the death of a relative. In Europe, there must have been 125 million people who have an after-death communication. And in the United States, about 100 million people, which means when you have been in contact with the conscious of deceased relatives, you can see them, you can communicate with them, you get sometimes information that should be impossible to know. You can feel them, you can smell them, etc. That proves that consciousness of a deceased relative is still somewhere in the non-local realm. When I give a lecture, which is mostly sold out in the Netherlands as well, 30 to 40% of the people who are attending my lecture, when I ask about, have had the after-death communication. And that's why they're sitting there to know more. Because when it seems to be possible to be in contact with the conscious of deceased relatives, that means, that proves that consciousness is still there. It's eternal. So we have to talk about it. And people with an after-death communication are also mostly silent about it. People with a near-death experience are always silent about it because nobody will believe them. So the main thing is, when there are 25 million people in Europe and 15 million people in the USA with a near-death experience, always ask them, please share it with others. Share it with your doctor. Talk about it with family members. So 70% of people with NDE are divorced because the partner said it's not the same person as before when we married. So you change a lot. It's not easy at all, but please share it with others so we can change our ideas about the mind-brain relationship.
Do you think that AI and emerging technologies could be useful? Could they add to the field of study in any meaningful capacity?
I don't think so. I think that there have been aware studies still trying to give some EEG registration during CPR, but it's very hard to do it, and it's an incomplete EEG, and you start only after 5 minutes or later, because before you are come with EEG to the patients in CPR. So I think we had enough studies done. And we had also studies done in induced cardiac arrest, also in animals. In animals, also the deeper structures of the brain stop functioning after 10 to 20 seconds as well. So we know the brain function stopped. We know that people can have conscious experience with enhanced consciousness and memories and possibility of perception. So what we need to do is talk about it, tell about it, write about it, give interviews about it. And I think that will help. But for neuroscientists, it's really a hard problem because they lose the position in university and lose their research money. So I understand that they are very reluctant to be open.
Yeah, I can understand from a scientific perspective the issues as well that they have trying to acquire empirical evidence. Yeah, and the challenge that they face. But your perspective is that you've got to include subjective experience, and you've got to start including it.
So what we did is an empirical study.
Mm,
So our study was published in the Lancet because the empirical study was well done and the statistics were well done. So it was a well done study in scientific point of view. And that's why they published it. Even an editorial board had some problems with it because of the subject of NDE. But the methodology was well done as now. So we had statistical analysis with empirical studies done. So we don't need more. For me, we don't need any more. When you have 562 patients who survive cardiac arrest in studies, I don't know if you will add information when you have 1,000 patients or so. But what's interesting now that a Spanish group is now starting to reproduce our study in Spanish-speaking countries. So we have now already 10 hospitals in Spain, Mexico, and South America, where they start to reproduce our study with the prospective and longitudinal aspects as well. It will take another 10 to 12 years. But it's very interesting. And we hope to have results within several years. We have to wait. But I'm convinced that they will have the same results as we had.
how have you changed as a result of this inquiry, Pim?
Yeah, well, I was told I was a material scientist, convinced that the brain was producing consciousness, and now I'm convinced that there is a non-local consciousness beyond the brain, and that we have to change the way we live, because I'm now convinced also that we are connected with each other and with nature. So we have to think about the environment. We have to think about the future of the planet Earth, where our children, grandchildren have to live and survive. So we have to change the way we live. My wife and I are vegetarian for more than 25 years now. We love to be outside each day. We try to be at least 1 hour in nature, walking or biking. We love our garden. In our house, it's always silent, no music at all, except when we start to listen to music, but it's always silent as well. So we're relaxed, we're happy, we're grateful for our life. We have 2 children, 5 grandchildren who are happy as well. So it's a good life, grateful. I'm nearly 82 or 81 years old now, and I'm still active, biking, walking each day.
And you would have no fear of death, right?
No, I'm not. I'm curious. It's not the same as people with a near-death experience. They're 100% sure. I think I'm 98% or 99% sure. And I think the process of dying is not easy at all. It's hard work. But death is a relief. Death is something else.
You did say in the book Consciousness Beyond Life that a small percentage of NDEers found the experience traumatizing and awful.
Yes, distressing NDEs. We don't know the exact number, perhaps 1 or 2%. Even patients who have a distressing NDE or hellish experience are more reluctant even to talk about it with others because they have a feeling of guilt as well. So perhaps 1 or 2% of those patients have a
1 or 2%
distressing experience, and they come in. Let's say when you have a positive near-death experience, about 50% of those patients come in a dark space, dark room. That can be frightening, and then they see a small light they're attracted to it. They call it the tunnel. But perhaps 1 or 2% stay in this dark room of going down in a kind of hellish experience. Also, George Ritchie was in this down realm somewhere. It's like a little bit like Divine Comedy of Dante. People can experience as well. I call it an incomplete NDE because they don't go to the light, come back. And there have been articles published about it and also a book published about it. They are not bad people, but they experience a distressing experience as well. And you should remember and realize that, well, when you experience what we call your reality around you, the world you see is depending on your state of consciousness. When you're alive, it's a beautiful world, and when you're depressed, it's an awful world, but it's still the same world. So when you are in the aspect of fear, you can have an experience of fear during an NDE, but it doesn't say anything about the person you are.
You also made the point that the mind can change brain functioning, right? And we know this, and this has been demonstrably proven to be true because, I mean, through meditation, through neuroplasticity. Can I ask you about that again?
Oh, of course. But the neuroplasticity is very important. When you're young children, there's hundreds of thousands of connections are being made each day in the brain of a small child. But when you change your consciousness, then you change the function of the brain. And we know it from placebo effect. When you have severe depression, of a lot of pain, of Parkinson's disease, and you get a placebo treatment, you see in the brain the same improvement than you see when you have a real treatment. So when you believe you're treated well, then your brain changes as well, and you have less complaints as well. So Parkinson's patients can move better. Depression is less, pain is less, etc. And we know it from meditation. When you have a long-term meditator, you have far more gamma waves in your brain. But also when you or I start to meditate for 6 weeks, then already your brain function changes as well. We have done studies in taxi drivers in London who have to know the London roads by heart. And it was hard work. And then you saw parts of the brain who became more hypertrophic, the part of the brain where you put your memories in. So you see that the brain changes. When you look of iris or so someone who plays piano, parts of the brain are more structures than others because you have a functional increase in brain function locally as well. So the brain reacts to changes in consciousness.
I noticed when reading the book that you did go through all the major religions, but there was no mention of a creator or God. And I felt you were deliberately staying away from that question. Perhaps I can ask you about it now.
Well, to be honest, I have never read the Bible at home as a young child. My father was atheist. He was a neurologist as well. And my mother was interested, but we didn't have, perhaps we had a Bible somewhere. But after I had talked to people in an NDE, I started to read the Bible. I started, especially the New Testament. I write to read about Tibetan Buddhism, about the Vedas and the Upanishads, the Hindus, about the Kabbalah, about Hinduism, about Judaism, about anthroposophy, etc. And all these main world religions, and also when you see in indigenous people as well, there's no end to consciousness. They always say that, and Plato has said this 2,500 years ago. He described a classical near-death experience with the soul, the earth, and he also writes that the body is just a temporary carrier of the eternal soul. So it has been known in all times and all religions, and I think there's something beyond comprehensive, and people call it God. I call it the divine consciousness of enhanced consciousness of non-local consciousness. It's just beyond comprehension. And everything starts from this consciousness, which for me is fundamental in the universe. So everything starts with consciousness together with energy and information. And everything what we see in our physical world is a product of consciousness. Our body is also a product of consciousness. Everything is a product of consciousness. So it's primary, it's fundamental. And a lot of very Nobel Prize winners have said it as well. I quoted in my book as well, in my article.
Yeah, you do. There's a chapter on quantum physics, and you do go into some depth there, which I have to confess was slightly above my pay grade. But it was a fascinating chapter. What I was thinking as I was reading it is some of the ideas and hypotheses proposed by quantum mechanics are so outlandish that compared to consciousness surviving death, that they, I mean, that's just a tiny, it's of no comparison. Lawrence Krauss wrote a universe from nothing. I mean, if consciousness is everywhere, then everything is on the table. That would be my only concern.
Quantum mechanics is just an analogy and not an explanation for consciousness. The analogy is that everything is always connected instantaneously, without beginning, without end, and beyond time, beyond space. That's the analogy with quantum physics, but this has been proven with the double split, etc. So that's something. And the other thing is, which is intriguing, that in quantum physics, consciousness seems to play a role. There's no objective observer. So the idea of the scientist who makes an experiment makes by this same moment the result of the experiment. So you can prove in the double split experiment that light behaves as waves, and you can prove that light behaves as particles. Both is true, but it should not be possible at all. But depends on the consciousness of the designer of the experiment, which makes the result. So consciousness is essential also. We are just part of the experiment, and there's no objective observer at all. Consciousness must be fundamental. And I know that when you have the possibility to see future events during your death experience, but also people can have prognostic dreams about some very special event, and then years later this happens, a funeral, marriage, or the déjà vu feeling when you come somewhere in a foreign country, you say, I've been here before. That means that future events are also available. That means when there is free will and people with the enhanced sensitivity see that someone will die in 6 months and he dies in 6 months, somewhere in a higher dimension must be fixed, this moment of death. But during life here on planet Earth, we have the free will. When our life should be from A to B, we will end at B, but we can take all the wrong directions during our life. That's the free will. But we eventually will end at B, independent of what we try to do.
What does the future hold for Dr. Pim van Lommel?
For me,
Mm.
I hope to be a little bit healthy for the next years and do what I'm doing now. I'm still receiving many emails each day. I'm giving interviews, I'm giving lectures all over the world. So I'm trying to share my ideas with others as well. I think that's important. Until I'm not here anymore, and then you can still read my books and see my interviews.
Yes. Dr. Pim van Lommel, thank you so much. It's been a real privilege. I feel very lucky to have had the opportunity to talk to you.
You're welcome.